Imagine a place where the walls breathe violence, where men sleep beside death and wake up screaming, where one wrong word, one wrong look could get you stabbed before sunrise. This isn't a war zone. It's a prison. And not just any prison. This was Carandiru, the most feared penitentiary in Brazil. A place so overcrowded that inmates ran their own government. A place where drugs, death, and desperation ruled the night. And in October 1992, it became the stage for one of the bloodiest massacres in modern history, when the police stormed in and killed 111 men in cold blood. But the truth about what happened inside those walls, who started it, who ordered it, and who survived, was buried beneath decades of corruption and silence. Tonight, we're going inside Brazil's deadliest prison. This is Carandiru Massacre, the prison that ate its own. São Paulo, 1980s. The city was booming, skyscrapers rising, business thriving. But beneath the surface, another city was growing. One made of concrete, filth, and fear. Carandiru Penitentiary was meant to hold 3,000 inmates. At its peak, it held nearly 8,000 pounds. Gang leaders, thieves, and killers, all packed into a space smaller than a football field. Cells were so crowded that inmates took turns sleeping, some standing, some hanging hammocks from the ceiling. There was no running water for days, the toilets overflowed. Disease spread faster than rumors. Guards didn't control the prison anymore. The inmates did. Every block had its own boss, and every dispute was settled with blades. Knives made from toothbrushes, spears made from bed frames. To survive in Carandiru, you had to become part of the system or be destroyed by it. October 2nd, 1992, a Saturday. A small fight breaks out in Pavilion 9, the largest cell block in Carandiru. No one knows exactly how it started. Some say it was a card game, others say a debt. But by the time the guards noticed, it had exploded into chaos. Blades flashed. Men screamed. Dozens of inmates were wounded within minutes. The guards locked the doors, trapping everyone inside. Then they called for backup. Outside the prison, the military police arrived in armored vehicles, armed with shotguns and automatic rifles. The order was simple: retake the prison, at any cost. At 2:00 p.m. the gates opened. Heavily armed police stormed Pavilion 9. Inside, the prisoners were cornered, many unarmed, waving white shirts, begging to surrender. But surrender wasn't part of the plan. Gunfire erupted. Shot after shot after shot. The echo of bullets bounced off the concrete walls for nearly 2 hours. When it stopped, the floor was covered in blood. Bodies piled on top of each other. 111 inmates dead. Not a single police officer killed. But the true horror wasn't just the number, it was how they died. Witnesses would later say the men were executed, shot at point-blank range while kneeling, unarmed. Some were still alive when the police entered the cells again to finish the job. One inmate later testified. They said, "Lay down." I did. Then they shot my friend in the head next to me. When they turned to me, I pretended to be dead. He survived by lying still under the weight of corpses for hours. The massacre ended when the commanding officer, Colonel Ubiratan Guimarães, ordered his men to pull back. The prison fell silent. But the silence was not peace. It was death. By nightfall, the government announced the operation was successful, order restored. But photos leaked the next morning told a different story. Piles of naked bodies, bullet holes in their backs, blood smeared on the walls. Brazil, and the world, demanded answers. Yet, justice in Brazil's system moved slower than its prisons. For years, No one was held accountable. Files vanished. Witnesses disappeared. And Colonel Guimarães? He was promoted. The massacre was buried. Until a doctor came forward with a story that would reopen old wounds. Dr. Drauzio Varella, a volunteer physician who worked inside Carandiru for years, was one of the few outsiders who truly saw what life inside was like. He treated the inmates, listened to their stories, watched them die from disease and neglect. After the massacre, he couldn't stay silent. He wrote a book, Escalation Carandiru, exposing everything, the filth, the hierarchy, the fear, and the massacre itself. His words sparked outrage and forced the world to see the prisoners not just as criminals, but as humans. It took 20 years for the case to reach court. Between 2013 and 2014, 74 officers were finally put on trial for the killings. Families of victims filled the courtroom, some still clutching photos of sons they hadn't buried. But the verdict was another tragedy. At first, the officers were sentenced, over 600 years combined. Then, in 2016, the convictions were overturned. The court ruled that the police had acted in self-defense, 10 men dead, and no one held responsible. In 2002, a decade after the massacre, Carandiru was finally demolished. Where the blood once ran through the corridors, now stands a public park. But for those who lived it, the ghosts never left. Former inmates still carry the scars, physical and emotional. And many of the police officers still refuse to talk. Because to speak is to admit, and to admit is to relive the nightmare. The Carandiru Massacre wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mirror, a reflection of a justice system where poverty fills the prisons and silence buries the dead. Today, Brazil's prisons remain among the most violent on earth. Overcrowded, underfunded, forgotten. The ghosts of Carandiru still whisper through every concrete cell across the country, a warning of what happens when a system decides some lives don't matter. They called it a riot, but history remembers it as a massacre in names and voices that will never speak again. And maybe the question isn't why it happened, but why it was allowed to happen at all. Because when the walls of a prison become a grave, we all share the guilt of what's buried inside. This is Carandiru, and its story is not over. To understand what happened inside Carandiru, you have to go back, before the blood, before the bullets. Because this massacre didn't start on October 2nd. It started years before, in the silence of a broken system. In the early 1980s, Brazil's prison population was exploding. Poverty, drug laws, and political unrest filled the cells faster than they could build them. Carandiru became the dumping ground for the unwanted. Murderers, pickpockets, political prisoners, even men who couldn't afford bail. But when the gates closed, they all became the same thing: forgotten. Inmates had no shoes. Some shared a single bar of soap among 20 men. The strong ruled, and the weak disappeared. Guards didn't enter without permission from the inmates themselves. Carandiru was more than a prison. It was a kingdom. And the king was the strongest man in Pavilion 9. His name was Antonio Negão Ferreira, though inside Carandiru everyone called him Blackie. He'd been serving 15 years for armed robbery, but in Pavilion 9 he was more than an inmate. He was a judge, executioner, and leader. If you wanted protection, you went to him. If you broke his rules, you vanished. But despite his power, Blackie wasn't the monster outsiders imagined. He enforced order in a place with none. One former inmate recalled, "If it wasn't for him, we would have all killed each other. The guards didn't care if we lived or died. He did." Blackie's rule kept Pavilion 9 stable. Until that day, when one argument over a soccer game sent the entire block spiraling into chaos. It started small. 2 inmates from rival factions fighting over who cheated in a match played in the dusty courtyard. A knife appeared, then another. Before long, 40 men were involved, screaming, swinging, stabbing. The guards panicked. They had no riot shields, no plan, no control. So they locked the gates. The fight raged inside, while the guards stood outside, listening. By the time reinforcements arrived, the prison yard looked like a battlefield. Several inmates lay bleeding, others still fighting. The captain in charge made a call, and that call would turn Carandiru into a massacre site. Colonel Ubiratan Guimarães was a man of discipline, a soldier. He believed order was restored through fear, not mercy. When he received the call, he didn't hesitate. He assembled over 300 heavily armed officers from the military police tactical unit, the most feared in São Paulo. They arrived at the prison in full combat gear, black uniforms, helmets, shotguns, and M16s. From the outside, Carandiru looked like a fortress, but inside, it was a trap. 8,000 men behind steel doors in panic, and Guimarães was about to light the match. 2:30 p.m. The gates to Pavilion 9 burst open. The first shots echoed through the courtyard, loud, sharp, unending. Prisoners screamed, scrambled for cover. Many tried to surrender, waving white shirts, lying on the ground, shouting, "Paz!" Peace. But the police didn't stop. Shotguns fired at close range. Automatic bursts rattled through the concrete corridors. Men fell by the dozens. The first victims were those who ran, the next, those who didn't. One survivor said, "I felt the heat on my neck. I thought it was fire. But it was the blood from the man behind me." For over 2 hours, the shooting continued, and when the echoes finally died, Carandiru was silent, dead silent. When the police withdrew, they left behind hell on earth. Piles of bodies lined the narrow halls. Blood soaked the floors so deeply it ran under cell doors. Inmates who survived were forced to drag the dead into the yard. They laid them out in rows, 111 men. No weapons were found beside most of the bodies, no bullet holes on the walls facing the officers. Because these weren't crossfire deaths, they were executions. Forensics would later prove many were shot while lying face down, and among the dead, some were only days from release. When Dr. Drauzio Varella entered Carandiru the next morning, the air still smelled of gunpowder and blood. He walked through the corridor, the same one he'd walked every week for years, treating inmates who'd become his patients, even his friends. Now they were gone, and his medical notebook, once filled with prescriptions, became a record of death. He wrote down names, injuries, bullet trajectories. The list grew longer than he could bear. He later said, "I didn't need to see the bullets to know they were executions. The eyes of the survivors said it all." Varella's testimony would later become the backbone of international human rights investigations, a voice cutting through a nation's denial. The years that followed were a blur of silence and manipulation. Officials claimed the prisoners had rioted violently, forcing the police to act. But survivors told a different story, one of surrender and slaughter. When the case finally went to trial decades later, the courtroom became a battlefield of its own. Survivors testified through tears. Families cried in the gallery. Lawyers showed photos too gruesome to display on national TV. The jury was shaken. 74 officers found guilty. The colonel himself sentenced to 632 years in prison. It seemed like justice. Until 2016. That's when the verdict was overturned. The court declared the officers acted in legitimate defense. No one served a day behind bars. Years later, Colonel Guimarães tried to return to politics. He even became a state representative. He said he had nothing to apologize for. But in 2001, his story ended violently. He was found dead in his apartment, shot once in the chest. Police called it a robbery, but no valuables were taken. Some say it was revenge. Others say it was justice. The truth died with him. When Carandiru was demolished in 2002, many cheered. They thought destroying the walls would erase the past. But pain doesn't vanish with concrete. In its place stands a park now, the Parc da Juventude, the Park of Youth. Children play soccer on the same ground where 111 men died. A plaque stands near the entrance, small, almost hidden. It reads, "In memory of those who lost their lives here." Nothing more, no names, no faces, as if even memory itself is afraid to stay too long. 30 years later, Brazil's prisons still overflow. Pavilion 9 might be gone, but its spirit, the violence, the neglect, the silence, still bleeds through the system. From Manaus to Rio, riots continue. The same screams, the same smoke, the same excuses. Carandiru wasn't just a massacre. It was a warning, a prophecy that no one listened to, because in the end, when justice sleeps, violence becomes the law. There are no monuments for the men who died, no graves with flowers, only whispers in the dark corners of history. One survivor, now old and free, once said, "They killed us once with bullets, then again with silence." He looked down at his hands, still shaking decades later. "Every night I hear them calling my name." The ghosts of Carandiru don't want revenge. They want remembrance. And every time the world forgets, another Carandiru is born. The story of Carandiru isn't just about a massacre. It's about a system that allowed it to happen and then tried to pretend it didn't. It's about the thin line between justice and cruelty and how easily power can cross it. When a prison becomes a graveyard, when silence becomes justice, humanity itself is on trial. The walls of Carandiru may be gone, but the blood beneath them will never wash away. This is Brazil's deadliest secret. This is the Carandiru Massacre.